In the suffocating darkness of plantation quarters across Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee between 1845 and 1852, a name was whispered with equal parts reverence and terror. They called him Silas the Silent, a slave who never spoke a word, but left a trail of mutilated masters across 3 states. He was beautiful beyond description, with features so striking that wealthy plantation owners paid fortunes to possess him. But every man who used Silas for their twisted pleasures paid a price more terrible than death. By the time authorities finally understood the pattern, 8 prominent slaveholders had been found castrated in their own beds, and Silas had disappeared like smoke into the night. Silas was born in 1823 on the Whitmore estate in Tidewater, Virginia, the son of a house slave named Grace whose own beauty had made her the target of unwanted attention. From his earliest years, Silas possessed an otherworldly attractiveness that transcended conventional standards. His skin was smooth copper, his features perfectly symmetrical, his eyes a startling hazel that seemed to see through people's souls. By the time he was 12, it was clear that Silas would become either a blessing or a curse, depending on who controlled him. What made Silas truly unusual, however, was his absolute silence. He had been born with a voice, had spoken his first words at the normal age, but at 7 years old, after witnessing something in the plantation house that no child should see, Silas stopped speaking entirely. For the next 30 years of his life, he would never utter another word. Some said trauma had stolen his voice, others claimed he had made a vow. But everyone agreed that the silence made him even more unsettling, and somehow more desirable to men whose appetites ran toward the forbidden. Master Richard Whitmore was the first to recognize Silas's commercial potential. When the boy turned 15 in 1838, Whitmore began receiving offers from other plantation owners who had glimpsed Silas during social visits. These were not offers to purchase a field hand or skilled laborer. These were offers from wealthy men seeking something they could not openly acknowledge wanting. Whitmore, always an opportunist, realized he could rent Silas to these men for extraordinary sums. He would send Silas to stay at other plantations for weeks or months at a time, officially as a skilled craftsman or house servant. But everyone involved understood the true nature of the arrangement. Silas would return to Whitmore's estate, and Whitmore would be substantially richer. The system was depraved but profitable, and in the antebellum South, profit trumped morality every time. The first man to rent Silas was Colonel Harrison Blackwood of Kentucky in the spring of 1838. Blackwood was a widower, 53 years old, owner of 3 plantations and over 400 enslaved people. He paid Whitmore $500 for 3 months of Silas's time, an astronomical sum that revealed exactly what kind of services he expected. Silas arrived at Blackwood's estate in April, carrying nothing but a small bundle of clothes and the silence that had become his defining characteristic. For 3 months, he lived in a private room off Blackwood's personal chambers, officially serving as the colonel's valet, but actually existing as his master's private possession in ways that made the other house slaves look away in shame and pity. What happened behind Blackwood's closed doors during those 3 months was known only to the 2 men involved. But when Silas returned to Virginia in July, he was different in ways that were impossible to articulate. The other slaves noticed something cold had entered his hazel eyes, something that suggested he had made a decision about his future that involved consequences no one could yet imagine. Colonel Blackwood was found in his bed 3 weeks later, castrated with surgical precision while he slept. He survived the attack but was permanently mutilated and psychologically destroyed. The incident was officially reported as a robbery gone wrong. Though nothing had been stolen, Blackwood refused to discuss the attack beyond claiming he had seen nothing, heard nothing, remembered nothing about his assailant. No one connected Silas to the attack. He had returned to Virginia weeks earlier and had dozens of witnesses who could confirm his presence at Whitmore's estate. The timing made it seem impossible for him to be involved, though a few slaves who understood the ways of the world wondered if impossible was the same as untrue. 6 months later, Whitmore rented Silas to a second man, Judge Marcus Thornwell of Richmond. Thornwell was 48, married with 4 children, a pillar of Virginia society who maintained the most respectable public persona, while harboring private desires that would destroy his reputation if revealed. He paid even more than Blackwood, $600 for 2 months, and Silas disappeared into Thornwell's private world. Judge Thornwell was found castrated in his study 2 months after Silas's rental period ended. Like Blackwood, he survived but was utterly broken. Unlike Blackwood, Thornwell attempted suicide 3 times in the following year before finally succeeding. Before his death, he burned all his personal papers and left a sealed letter with his attorney that was never opened, his final secrets dying with him. The pattern continued with devastating consistency over the next 7 years. Silas would be rented to a wealthy man for an extended period. He would serve his time silently and return to Whitmore's estate. Weeks or months later, the man who had rented him would be found castrated, the attack always occurring while the victim slept, always executed with surgical precision, always leaving the victim alive to endure the physical and psychological aftermath. The third victim was Senator William Crandall of Tennessee, discovered mutilated in his Nashville townhouse in 1840. The fourth was plantation owner Thomas Beauregard of Louisiana, attacked in 1841. The fifth was railroad magnate Jonathan Whitfield, found in his private train car in 1843. The sixth was shipping merchant David Preston, attacked in his Charleston mansion in 1845. Each victim was wealthy, powerful, and outwardly respectable. Each had rented Silas for extended periods under various pretenses. Each had used him for purposes they could never publicly acknowledge. And each paid the same terrible price, stripped of their masculinity in the most literal and brutal way possible. Authorities in multiple states failed to recognize the pattern for years. These were private crimes involving circumstances the victims refused to discuss. The attacks occurred in different states, sometimes years apart, with no obvious connection between the victims beyond their wealth and status. And Silas, who never spoke, and who always had alibis placing him hundreds of miles away when the attacks occurred, was never suspected. But someone was paying attention. Dr. Samuel Harrison, a physician who had treated 3 of the victims, began noticing similarities in their injuries. The cuts were identical in placement and depth, suggesting the same hand had inflicted them. More significantly, all 3 men had recently employed a silent slave named Silas in some capacity, though they claimed the timing was coincidental. Dr. Harrison took his suspicions to authorities but was dismissed. The idea that an enslaved person could be attacking wealthy white men across multiple states without being caught seemed preposterous. More importantly, powerful people wanted the investigation stopped because any serious inquiry would expose the victim's sexual exploitation of enslaved people, a practice everyone knew existed but no one wanted to acknowledge publicly. The 7th victim was Master Richard Whitmore himself. In the spring of 1847, 9 years after he had begun renting Silas to other men, Whitmore was found castrated in his own bed at his Virginia estate. The attack was identical to all the others, surgical precision, no witnesses, the victim left alive to suffer. But this time, Silas was not hundreds of miles away. He was living in Whitmore's own slave quarters, making his involvement seem impossible. When questioned, Silas communicated through written notes, his silence as complete as ever. He had been in his cabin all night. Other slaves confirmed this, and he showed no signs of blood or injury that would suggest violent struggle. Authorities searched his possessions and found nothing incriminating. Without evidence or even a plausible theory of how Silas could have committed the crime while witnesses placed him elsewhere, he was not charged. But Whitmore, lying mutilated and terrified in his bed, knew the truth. He sold Silas immediately, desperate to remove the silent threat from his property. The buyer was a notorious slave trader named Jacob Harmon, who specialized in difficult cases and knew how to break resistant slaves through systematic brutality. Harmon's plan was to transport Silas to the Deep South and sell him to plantation owners who worked their slaves to death in the cotton fields. But during the journey through Tennessee, Silas escaped from Harmon's slave coffle, vanishing into the night as if he had never existed. 3 days later, Harmon was found beside the road, castrated and left to die slowly from blood loss and infection. Silas became the 8th and final victim, though some historians argue Harmon's death was justified self-defense rather than murder. Either way, it marked the end of Silas's documented trail through the historical record. He disappeared completely after Harmon's death, leaving behind only the trail of mutilated masters and whispered legends about the silent slave, who had exacted perfect revenge on every man who violated him. The story of Silas the Silent spread through the underground railroad network and slave communities across the South. It became a cautionary tale for masters who abused their power, a story of resistance that transcended conventional rebellion. Unlike slaves who fought back with immediate violence and were quickly captured and killed, Silas had played a long game, using his silence and his apparent vulnerability as weapons more devastating than any physical assault. Modern analysis of the historical record confirms the basic facts of Silas's story. Between 1838 and 1847, 8 wealthy men in Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Louisiana were found castrated in circumstances that authorities could not explain. All had employed or rented a slave matching Silas's description in the months before their attacks. All refused to cooperate fully with investigations, suggesting they were hiding something about the nature of their relationship with their attacker. Medical records from the period show that the injuries were remarkably consistent, indicating either the same perpetrator or a shared technique. The precision of the cuts suggested someone with anatomical knowledge beyond what most people of any race or class possessed in that era. This has led some historians to theorize that Silas may have learned basic surgical techniques by observing doctors who treated plantation injuries, or possibly had been taught by someone with medical training. The psychological dimension of Silas's revenge was perhaps more devastating than the physical mutilation. By leaving his victims alive, he ensured they would spend the rest of their lives bearing the consequences of their actions. Each would wake every day to physical evidence of what they had done and what had been done to them in return. The psychological torture of that permanent reminder was arguably worse than death. The silence that defined Silas took on symbolic meaning in the telling and retelling of his story. Some interpreted it as representing the voicelessness of all enslaved people, whose testimonies were not recognized in courts, whose complaints were ignored, whose suffering was systematically silenced. Silas's refusal to speak became a form of resistance itself, a rejection of the master's language and the master's narrative. Others saw his silence as strategic rather than symbolic. By never speaking, Silas revealed nothing. He could not be interrogated, could not accidentally reveal information, could not be tricked into confession. His silence was armor that protected him as effectively as any physical weapon. The question of how Silas managed to attack men who lived hundreds of miles away, while witnesses placed him elsewhere, has never been satisfactorily answered. Several theories exist, each with supporting evidence but none definitively proven. The first theory suggests Silas had accomplices, other slaves or freed people who traveled on his behalf to carry out the attacks according to his planning. This would explain the identical surgical precision and timing while providing Silas with perfect alibis. However, no historical evidence of such a network has ever been discovered. The second theory proposes that Silas himself traveled to commit the attacks, moving secretly through the night and returning before his absence was noticed. This seems nearly impossible given the distances involved and the surveillance enslaved people faced. But some historians argue that the Underground Railroad network had sophisticated methods for moving people secretly that could have been adapted for Silas's purposes. The third theory, more controversial, suggests that Silas somehow poisoned or drugged his victims during his rental periods, using substances that remained dormant in their bodies for weeks or months, before causing the mutilations through some kind of necrotic process. This theory lacks medical plausibility, but has persisted in some accounts of the story. The most likely explanation, according to modern forensic psychologists, is that Silas used a combination of tactics. He may have established connections with other enslaved people during his travels who were willing to act on his behalf. He may have learned the victim's routines and vulnerabilities during his rental periods, information he could share with others who would carry out the attacks. His silence ensured he could never be coerced into revealing these accomplices. After his disappearance in 1847, reported sightings of Silas occurred throughout the South and into the North. Some claimed he had joined the Underground Railroad as a conductor, using his experience moving secretly to help others escape. Others said he had established a community of escaped slaves in the Great Dismal Swamp, living beyond the reach of slave catchers. During the Civil War, Union soldiers reported encountering a silent man who matched Silas's description, working as a scout and spy for Northern forces. His inability to speak was apparently no handicap for gathering intelligence, and his intimate knowledge of plantation layouts made him invaluable. However, these accounts remain unverified. The last confirmed sighting of someone matching Silas's description occurred in 1869 in Philadelphia, where a silent man of the right age was working as an orderly in a hospital for freed people. When a journalist attempted to interview him about his past, asking directly if he was Silas the Silent, the man smiled and walked away, without responding in any way. The legacy of Silas's story extends far beyond the specific acts of revenge he committed. His tale became part of the oral tradition of resistance that sustained enslaved communities through the darkest periods of oppression. It demonstrated that power imbalances were not absolute. that even the most vulnerable person could find ways to hold the powerful accountable. Modern scholars studying the story have noted how it complicates simplistic narratives about slavery and resistance. Silas was both victim and perpetrator, both utterly powerless and devastatingly effective. His actions were morally complex, defending himself while also exacting revenge that some might consider excessive. His story forces confrontation with uncomfortable questions about justice, revenge, and the limits of acceptable resistance to oppression. The sexual exploitation that Silas endured and avenged has only recently been acknowledged as a significant dimension of slavery's horrors. For generations, historical accounts emphasized the physical labor and brutality of slavery, while minimizing or ignoring the sexual abuse that particularly affected enslaved people considered attractive. Silas's story, precisely because it centers on sexual violence and revenge, has become important for understanding the full scope of slavery's dehumanization. In 2012, a researcher discovered a sealed court document from 1851 that referenced the silent Negro who has visited vengeance upon certain gentlemen of quality. The document discussed whether authorities should suppress information about the attacks to avoid encouraging similar resistance among other enslaved people. The decision to keep the cases as separate, unconnected incidents rather than acknowledging a pattern was explicitly intended to prevent Silas from becoming a symbol of successful resistance. That effort at suppression obviously failed. Silas became legendary precisely because authorities tried to hide his story. The whispered accounts that circulated through slave quarters were more powerful than any official narrative, because they represented hope, proof that even the most oppressed person could fight back effectively if they were patient, intelligent, and strategic. Today, historians continue to debate whether the story of Silas the Silent is primarily historical fact or cultural mythology. The 8 castrations are documented in various medical and legal records. The existence of a slave named Silas who worked for multiple wealthy men and then disappeared is confirmed in plantation records, but the direct connection between Silas and all 8 attacks remains circumstantial, based on timing and opportunity rather than definitive evidence. Perhaps the truth of Silas's story lies somewhere between documented history and mythological archetype. Whether Silas personally committed all 8 acts of revenge, or whether he became the symbolic representation of multiple acts of resistance by different enslaved people, his story served and continues to serve an important purpose. It reminds us that oppression always generates resistance, that victims are not powerless, and that silence can be its own form of devastating testimony. The final mystery of Silas's life, whether he survived to old age or died young, whether he found peace or carried his trauma forever, remains unsolved, but perhaps that ambiguity is appropriate. Silas the Silent came from silence, moved through history silently, and disappeared back into silence. His voice was stolen, but his actions spoke louder than words ever could. And in the end, his silence became the most powerful statement of all, an eternal refusal to provide the confessions, explanations, or justifications that his oppressors demanded but never deserved.